Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation on Franchise, the Golden Arches in Black America by Marcia Chatelain, who is a professor of history, as well as the 2021 Pulitzer winner in history. We are so proud of Dr. Chatelain and excited to host her for this conversation today. If you didn't get a copy, I will copy the link to our event where we can purchase the book and also borrow the book from the DC Public Library, where they have a few copies available for you. Uh, I'm Dr. Melissa Hafaf. I'm the program director for the Gender Justice Initiative. We are a cross-campus effort that's designed to support and nurture research, as well as projects related to intersectional gender justice. And today we are delighted to partner with the DC Public Library, who has been a partner with us for over a year now, where we get to present books by Georgetown authors that deal with all kinds of intersectional social justice issues. A special thanks to Wendell Keller, my partner at the Georgetown branch. And as you can see, we love to collaborate. So if you do have any ideas of events that you'd like to see, please get in touch with us. I'll put the information in the chat. Before we start, a couple of logistical points. Please use the Q&A function if you want to ask questions at any point during the conversation. Thanks for those who actually asked questions prior to the event. There were a lot of amazing questions that we tried to integrate into the first part of the conversation. So if you don't see your question answered, please don't hesitate to ask the question again. And now let me introduce you to our moderator for the conversation, who kindly accepted to be in conversation with Professor Chatelain, who is Professor Mike Amezcua, who is a professor of history at Georgetown University. And his research and teachings focus on Latinx history, urban studies, race, politics, and immigration. I will now pass the mic on to you, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. And thanks to everyone that has joined us virtually today. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest this afternoon, and also my colleague and dear friend, Dr. Marcia Chatelain. Marcia is professor of history and African American studies at Georgetown University. She is a scholar of African American life and culture, and a consummate public intellectual with a gift for analyzing our contemporary societal problems with deep historical insight, compassion, and accessibility. She has been a contributor to The Atlantic, Time Magazine, The Chronicle of Higher Ed, and has made a number of appearances on national television outlets, including MSNBC, CNN, BBC America, PBS, and many others. And yes, she has been on many, many podcasts, at times as host and other times as guest, and always providing the freshest takes and meeting the moments we find ourselves in. In 2014, when Ferguson, Missouri erupted in an uprising against a police killing of Michael Brown, Marcia organized her fellow scholars in a social media response to the crisis entitled The Ferguson Syllabus, as a way to give context to the historical conditions that led to the over-policing of economically marginalized communities of color. To educate, contextualize, and mobilize has been part of Marcia's MO from the very beginning. She has led initiatives to help shape curricular projects in K-12 schools and in university settings. She is a frequent public speaker and consultant to educational institutions, delivering lectures and workshops on inclusive teaching, on social movements, and on food justice. She has earned many awards and fellowships, including being named a National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Fellow, an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, and an Eric and Wendy Schmidt Fellow at the New America Foundation, to name just a few. Along with many articles, both scholarly and popular, Marcia is the author of two brilliant books, the second one of which is the subject of our conversation today, but the first one, which is set in her beloved hometown of Chicago, published by Duke University Press, South Side Girls, growing up in the Great Migration, centers the lives of young Black women and girls who made their own meaning out of the segregated landscape of the Windy City and whose voices were often left out in the building and experience of the Black metropolis. Marcia shows us how they built community as children, as daughters, and as workers. Her second book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, published by Liveright and an imprint of W. Norton, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize this year. As the New York Times wrote in a review of her book, quote, franchise is a serious work of history, showing how the fast food industry became the undisputed beneficiary of government largesse, and how a highway system bisected communities and created captive markets, offering McDonald's an opportunity for remarkable growth in the 1970s when the growth of suburban outlets was flagging, end of quote. Along with the Pulitzer, franchise has earned many, many awards and prizes. To list them all here today would add another hour to our event. So I'll end with this. To read Marcia's work is to have a conversation with her one-on-one. I invite you to do so. It is all at once illuminating, sobering, and transformational. Please join me in welcoming Marcia Chatelain.
Mike, are you serious? Thank you so much for that welcome. Gosh, that was so beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for joining us today. We are really excited to speak with you about your award-winning book and to really kind of try to get at some of the core central themes of your book today. There's a lot of enthusiasm from our visitors that are with us, along with, of course, the sponsors of today's event. And so I'll start with a kind of blended question that that is brought to us by the Gender and Justice Initiative folks, but also a little bit by the visitors who sent kind of pre-questions, right? And that is, how did you come to this project, or what led you to write this book? Was there a particular question or moment in your life that set this project into motion?
Well, first, I want to say thank you to the DC Public Library and the Gender Justice Initiative for putting this event together. And I also am so grateful for people to show up to yet another Zoom event. I know that Zoom allows us a level of accessibility, but I know it's sometimes hard to be kind of not present with each other. And so I'm grateful for everyone showing up. You know, it's when I think about the origins of this book, you know, so much of it is tied to this broader theme that brings us to today around issues of gender, that in terms of kind of my own curiosity as a little girl, you know, I grew up in a household where people had to work a lot to survive. And so I was always reading something, right? Like I remember standing in line with my mom going to currency exchanges. Did I just either date myself or regionalize myself? A currency exchange is like, what would you say it's like? It's like places where you can like do money orders. I don't know. A lot of immigrants use it to like wire money overseas. Do they still exist?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So currency exchange is like the kind of secondary financial measure for like working class people and immigrants. I'll return to that. But like I remember as a kid standing in line at the currency exchange, and if there was a brochure, just reading the brochure. Just everything around me was an opportunity to absorb something. And when I think about the origins of this project, I think about, you know, the way that McDonald's was one of the places that provided material for absorption that had nothing to do with the food. And so when I think of McDonald's growing up in Chicago in the 1980s, I think of events like the Bud Billiken Parade, which was like the Black back to school parade, and seeing, you know, the sponsorship of the local Black McDonald's operators. When I think about the early Martin Luther King Jr. holiday and watching these mini documentaries about Dr. King, I think of those sponsorships. And so part of what I think brought me to this project was this incredible curiosity that was always kind of available to me as a kid, being in places where you had to wait in line for stuff. And the second part of it is this idea of proximity, of thinking about the outsized presence that McDonald's has had on my life, not just as a consumer, but as an intellectual, as someone whose first kind of exposure to serious Black history and the Great Migration happened because McDonald's sponsored a Black History Month event. And so I think when I was in graduate school, I always thought about that relationship and the uneasiness of the corporate entity kind of facilitating my intellectual life.
Definitely. No, a lot of what you just said resonates with me. Also being a child of the 80s and seeing the McDonald's in the neighborhood as a space where it becomes more than just the food, right? So, you mentioned the Great Migration, and as a historian and as your friend, I often think about, I wonder what Marcia thinks about the connections between her two books. And so if I could just go there to see how you articulate that connection between your first book, South Side Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration, and franchise. And maybe tell us a little bit about, perhaps some through lines or set of ideas that connects one book to the other for you.
For me, so this is like such an unlikely career path when I think about what I thought my future would look like. I was a pretty good writer really liked writing in high school, and I really liked my English classes. And so I had gone to college to study journalism, and I thought I would be a news reporter. And this again was before online was a thing. And so I thought I'd work for a magazine and they would have, offices and people with salaries. And we know that landscape has changed. But all of this is to say that when I was in college, I really kind of discovered the joy of long writing, of research-based writing. And with my first book, Southside Girls, I was trying to figure out something about my childhood. I guess that's a deeply Freudian way of understanding why we write history. But I wanted to write a book about African-American girls that suggested that girls were the solution and not the problem. Because I had grown up in the 80s and 90s in the era of daytime talk shows. And this is when shows like Ricki Lake, Maury Povich, Montel Williams, Oprah Winfrey had kind of given birth to the form. But a lot of these shows were about this idea of young Black women as problems, as either being too aggressive, too loud, getting into fights, having unplanned pregnancies that really bothered people. And a lot of the political discourse that also was emerging, I think, among a lot of Black groups was that investment in young men was the future. And so there's this weird kind of thing that I saw with a deep anxiety about how girls appeared in public. And then the idea that investing in young men was going to solve the problems of Black community in the age of the war on drugs and over policing and gang violence. And so there was just a lot of noise. And so I wanted to write a book in which I wanted to reimagine Black origins in urban cores as a response to thinking about girlhood as a powerful, a powerful construction in why families make the decision to leave the South and go North, how people intervene in public policy, how people narrate rhetoric around the family and citizenship. What if girls were at the center of it? How could we reimagine the ways that people talk about girls and young women? And so, my first book was it was really hard to finish. For those of you who are close friends, Carol Sargent is here, and Carol Sargent was, the patron saint of rescuing this book from a number of issues. But I say this because what I realized I was doing in that book, maybe years after it was published, is I was trying to figure out what I wanted my contribution as a scholar to be. And it wasn't just saying, here's some novel ways of looking at Black history, because anytime we think we've come up with an idea, we find out that 10 other people had the same thought. But I really wanted to challenge this idea of sources and archive. A lot of people said, well, you can't write about Black children because they didn't leave papers behind. They're not in the archive. And in fact, they are in the archive. The question is, do we care to listen? And so I think with the confidence that I gained from figuring that out for Southside Girls, I also wanted to embark on this book about writing a history of McDonald's without having access to any of McDonald's internal documents. How do we write corporate history without the cooperation of the corporation? And what is possible in talking about McDonald's when we put Black people at the center of it?
Terrific. That makes a lot of sense, the way you tell these stories through essentially without having to privilege the archival corporation, the corporate archives, or the institutions that were largely, in the case of the first book, dismissive of young Black girls. So that makes a lot of sense. The way that I think about a connection to both of your books is really in this kind of sense of world creation. Your first book is kind of recreating a Great Migration Chicago, yes, centering Black women and Black girls, but really, but also putting the uglier underbelly of inequality and disinvestment into play in ways that your second book will continue to flesh out that second part of the 20th century. And so maybe we can touch on that here and there as we move forward with some of these questions. But if I can, let me get into franchise itself. And one of the things that strikes me about the early part of this book, as a Californian myself, is in thinking about these first families of the fast food franchising, how clustered they are in Southern California, in Los Angeles, in San Bernardino County, along the foothills, right? And so, and you do well to explain the kind of world that those families come from. But I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about these first families of fast food franchising, and if they ever thought about their customers diversifying, right, ethnically and racially, and if they didn't, which it sounds like they didn't, why did they have these blind spots?
So this is an interesting kind of story about how fast food has kind of three lives in America. So the origins of fast food, the idea of eating like something like a hamburger cheap and getting it quickly, is associated with the urban core as something to serve construction workers. So one of the early stories of White Castle, for instance, was that White Castle was super popular with working class people, construction workers, and then people who had way too much to drink. And, folks of a certain age know that feeling of like why White Castle works after a long night out. So it was considered kind of low class, very much not suitable for middle class families. But then White Castle was so delicious, as the story goes, that middle class white women were sending out their servants to go purchase White Castle, and so it became this food that was kind of okay for people of a certain class to eat. And a lot of this comes from the exposés from books like The Jungle about the meat industry. So ground meat did not have the kind of acceptance as a part of a regular diet as it does today. So let's fast forward to Southern California. So the reason why Southern California is able to give birth to so many of the big chains that we still have today, In-N-Out, McDonald's, Carl's Jr., is because I think that there are two things that are working in California in the 1940s. One, we still have a lot of cheap land and there's room to grow. The growing suburbanization of Southern California. The weather also contributes to it because fast food was considered something you ate outside. And then the rise of car culture after World War II, in which people are now using their cars as a mode of entertainment. And so all of this contributes to the ability for this part of the country to give birth to not just the brands, but then the mechanization of the production of fast food. There's fast food chains in the Midwest, there's some in the South, but a lot of these Southern California families, I think, they're part of a rising evangelical culture. I think religion plays a large part of it, about a kind of relationship to wealth and prosperity that will also fuel them in the 60s and 70s. And so when people think of McDonald's, for instance, they often think of Ray Kroc because he's the iconic founder. But the real founders, the McDonald's brothers, Ronald and Maurice, I write about how they really do symbolize the generation of white entrepreneurs who are able to fail upward. They fail often, but they're always given breaks until they develop the concept of McDonald's.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that was really striking to see the McDonald's brothers in your book, and the many times that they have to reinvent themselves essentially until they really strike it with a clientele that is devoted to their cheap but tasty burgers. So let me move on to something that is not fully fleshed out in a chapter, but that you touch on in a meaningful way, which is this notion of the hiring of women at McDonald's, right? Early on, it seems that the McDonald's brothers find their young women employees perhaps too distracting to the clientele, right? And so that's kind of one way that women figure into the hiring of McDonald's early on. But then fast forward to the late 60s, early 1970s, and the first Black franchisees of McDonald's, they actually open up their hiring to young women, right? Young women of color. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that arc and that shift?
Yeah, sexism is evergreen in every industry. So when we think about the early fast food industry, the way it markets itself in the 1950s, it's kind of in this tense place because on one hand, it is the ultimate teen hangout. It's the place where young people who are growing in terms of the high school attendance population. And high schools in the 1950s are very steeped into heterosexual culture. It's the origin of the prom, cutest couples in yearbooks. And this idea that this will be the place where, young people will learn to date and find a lifetime partner. And so all of this is to say, hanging out after school in the fast food place becomes a really big part of teenage socialization. And so the McDonald's brothers initially, they're near a high school, they're near San Bernardino High School, and they're getting a lot of good business from the high school students, but they're loud. They're using young women as car hops and they're flirting with the boys. They're stealing silverware. And so when McDonald's kind of closes and reinvents itself, it gets rid of the silverware and then starts using plastic paper wrapping for its food. It fires the young women so that they could really focus on efficiency and delivery. And they now want it to be a family-friendly place. And so they're marketing to housewives, they're marketing to ascendant middle-class families to say, this can be a place for your kids to come and enjoy a night out, give mom a break. And so, gender figures so prominently in how these ideas of what fast food is supposed to do for families. So when we get to the period of time where McDonald's is growing in its presence in Black communities, a lot of the early Black franchisees, they need to get a good workforce into their stores. They're in a lot of places in which there is very high youth unemployment, and they, excuse me, they're concerned about, thank you, about, who's trainable, who's trusted. And that's when you start to see more young Black women working at McDonald's. And one of the things that people are often surprised when I share with them, when I was doing interviews for this book, I met a Black woman in her 60s, and she said, when I first came up in the McDonald's system, I couldn't get a job as a manager because they weren't used to seeing Black women as McDonald's managers. It was a very big deal. And so this creates a route into some mobility within the service sector for this group of women who had previously kind of been put out. And then the last thing I'll say about kind of gender and fast food, what starts to happen in the 1970s, interestingly enough, is that there's a real backlash against women serving their children fast food because it's a response to this idea that women have overtaken the labor market because of the feminist movement, when in reality it's because of the economic hardships families that had previously been able to survive on one income, they can't do that into the 1970s. And so the idea of working women as failing at home gets mapped onto the fast food industry. Now they're just feeding their kids burgers instead of being able to cook. So you start to see the different ways that the kind of misogyny that is projected on to fast food shifts and changes as the fast food industry grows.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, in thinking about people that are picking up your book, perhaps not a historian, but a general reader or a young reader that hears the phrase Black capitalism in kind of fresh takes in on Twitter or in social media, um, they're going to learn a lot about the kind of Black capitalism a lot of people are talking about, but they're also going to learn a lot about earlier histories of Black capitalism in the 19th century through your book. You do well to explain to your readers that this is not a new thing in the 70s, and that actually African American communities have kind of struck out on their own attempts at economic empowerment that go back a long time. And so I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more to those kinds of readers about these kind of two distinct moments of Black capitalism in America.
So, Black capitalism as a framing idea, it has different names and it makes itself visible in different ways throughout time. But it's this idea that there is ultimately a gap because of racism between the individual and the resources and privileges that are associated with citizenship, whether it's the right to vote, the right to access public schools, the right to fair wages. There's always this gap. And under the framework of Black capitalism, there's this idea that earning money through business helps close the gap or sometimes just soothe the consequences of that gap. And so in the 19th century, we have Black, today there's so much talk about Black-owned businesses and you have to support a Black-owned business. And I have all sorts of critiques about that we can return to, but it's this idea that what Black business at the very least could do is to create enough capital to either protect or create negotiation with the larger power structure. So in the 19th century, even before emancipation, you have some Black land owning, you have some Black real estate owning, you have African Americans setting up a little bit of business, you have enslaved people able to kind of earn wages on a contract basis or by selling vegetables, right? You have these different ways that people are going to earn a little money, and what they're going to do with that money is they're going to buy the freedom of their family members. They're going to buy their own freedom. They're going to be able to try to find a place for themselves in a world that does not accommodate or acknowledge them. And so in this period of time with the rise of fast food industry, everyone is talking about Black capitalism as, oh, this is what we were supposed to do, right? Like we have this long period of time where people are dying for the right to vote. We have this period of time where people are putting their children through incredible trauma to be able to access a public school. We have people who are, getting sprayed with acid when they try to swim in a public pool. We have all of this incredible courage to try to access rights, and we don't have a lot to show for it. So maybe what we should do is really focus on building our economic power within our communities. And so there is a direct line between that person who is earning to try to buy their freedom to the Black funeral home owner who was able to negotiate for maybe another Black elementary school in a town in exchange for discouraging people for, advocating for their voting rights, to today where Twitter is just like aflame with these conversations about whether Jay-Z's, what is the Rock Nation brunch, whether paying $10,000 to go to a brunch is a good investment if you learn, the secrets of Black billionaires, blah, 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 and Rihanna's making a fortune, So all of these conversations about what does Black wealth actually mean and what can it translate to into the quality of everyday people's lives.
Terrific, thank you for that. So I think I have time for one more of my own questions before I pivot to audience questions. But I do want to make sure that I ask this one because I found it to be one of the most remarkable parts of your book, which is this idea that that to McDonald's corporate headquarters, that Black franchisees, and here I'm thinking of Petty and folks that are in DC and in the aftermath of the King assassination, that they're the ones that are going to be the right kind of translators of urban America to corporate America, right? That McDonald's needs to find folks that can really be the face of their business, of their corporation in the inner city. Um, as you say, to reconcile King's dream with Crocs's dream, which I love. And so I guess I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that relationship, and as translators of Black America, right? And maybe where that doesn't pan out. I know you have a lot of examples in the book, but maybe some of your favorite examples.
Yeah, so it's like a real three-ring circus, or rather a clown car, just filled with people who are in relationship or in conversation with McDonald's. So after King's assassination, McDonald's says, okay, we're going to start looking at the Black urban market, and they do it in a number of ways. But one of the things that this book points to, and after you finish a book, you think about all of the things that you should have written in it, but it's also codifying like corporate diversity and inclusion frameworks, the things that we're used to today. How there's a racist incident at a business and they send like thoughts and prayers and solidarity, and the kind of rhetoric that can often come up very empty when something happens. This period of time in the late 60s, the idea of it and the form of that is being developed, and McDonald's is at the front line of it. So they're saying things like they're being socially progressive by opening restaurants in Black communities, and they're saying that we are listening to the people because we're providing hamburgers in this way. But the team that is part of it is just this incredible motley crew of people who are coming from all sorts of backgrounds. The first African American to franchise a McDonald's is this guy who was a barber in Chicago, and he's considered a trusted member of the community. So he reopens a store that's abandoned by a white franchise owner. You've got people who were very integral in the civil rights movement. People like Hank Thomas, who was a freedom rider, who almost lost his life testing bus segregation laws in the South. He makes the pivot from Dairy Queen and then later McDonald's franchises, and he grows incredibly wealthy in the South doing that. You have people like Julian Bond, who later runs for Congress. He also becomes a big ally to McDonald's as they try to recruit more African Americans to their system. And so there's this weird way that the fast food industry, because of its wealth, because of its influence, because of its power, gets a lot of people to sign on to it. And I think what we see, to round out your question, is that there's this weird moment where, the politics of fast food become so untenable that we can actually have Black politicians say, you know what, I'm really not into fast food. I'm not going to align with McDonald's. But for many years, and up to now, serious civil rights groups like the NAACP and the Urban League, they work in partnership with McDonald's because that corporate entity has so much power and influence. And this is why I think this book is really about constrained choices. Do people really feel like the fast food industry is a good thing for Black people? Well, maybe they don't, but what they do see is a possibility and an opportunity because of that gap I talked about earlier. Because what else can communities attract, and what else can people hope for?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's I find that really remarkable in terms of the core themes of your book, and how you really you ask a profound question about the role of these corporations in urban America. You also show us the ills of having these corporations essentially have their way with these communities, but then you also demonstrate how communities themselves speak back and demand answers and accountability for the profits that they're making, and the kind of low sense of delivery to these communities, right? So um, I'm going to pivot to some of the great questions that were posed by people that are RSVP'd for this event. But before I do that, I'm going to read a question by Glenn Williamson, who is curious to hear your thoughts on McDonald's relocation of its main headquarters from suburban Oak Brook, Illinois, to the near West Side in Chicago, a very swank area now. Does this show any greater focus on urban issues and or the African American community?
Absolutely not. One of the reasons why McDonald's went out to Oak Brook was because it used to be in downtown Chicago. And then in the late 60s, with the uprisings, especially after King's assassination, they moved out to the suburbs. And, Ray Kroc always said that the suburbs is where McDonald's grew up. And so this is where the corporation was comfortable, and they had a main campus, they had a campus there, and they had the Hamburger University. Their decision to come into the city, and I believe they're in Oprah Winfrey's old studio space. Are they in the old Harpo Studios? They came at a moment where that part of the city had been deeply gentrified for a long time. Google and Uber, I believe, have offices in that area. There's a very, very nice strip of very expensive restaurants a few blocks from there on Randolph and Lake. And so it is, it is not the near West Side of the era in which, McDonald's was first trying this strategy.
No, definitely not. Thank you for that. And so, we have some terrific questions from people that are in the audience. I'll ask a few of these. One is the universal question for authors of history. Was there something exciting that didn't make it into the book that you can share with us?
There was so much on the cutting room floor. Some people had some really terse comments about the relationship to McDonald's that was not for public consumption. But one of the things that I thought was really curious was that there's this whole other story that someone else should write about suppliers. And McDonald's attempt to recruit minority suppliers shortly after they did the franchising. And so there was a sausage company, I think there was a hamburger buns manufacturer, but some of the real challenges of actually supplying a McDonald's mirror some of the challenges that the Black franchise owners got. So that didn't make it into the book. And, I could really go down some rabbit holes. The first draft of this book is a mess because there are just so many non sequiturs. I thought I wish that I could have spent a little bit more time talking about the Black celebrities that tried to give McDonald's a run for their money by suggesting that they had businesses that were more authentically Black owned. Mahalia Jackson does that with Glory Fried Chicken. Muhammad Ali has Champ Burger. At one point, James Brown gives a press conference, I believe in 1969. He's like, I'm not doing music anymore. I need to focus on my franchise, Gold Platter restaurants. And it's all like a scam. So I think, I would have, if I could have added another chapter, it would have been more about, the rise of Black celebrities, especially in the sports space, who are trying to lease their images to these really white-owned fast food companies that they're trying to suggest is Black owned and more authentic.
Yeah, no, thank you. I did pick up a sense of that alternative history of Black fast food entrepreneurs, and yeah, to see some of these names, Mahalia Jackson, James Brown, Muhammad Ali, is amazing. I had no idea. Were you going to mention another celebrity?
Sammy Davis Jr. gets involved in this too. I mean, and this is something that I think it's easy to lose sight of today when you have people like, Drake and Michael Jordan and, Travis Scott, like these big headliner Black entertainers and sports figures being able to kind of sell McDonald's. This was not a huge reality for Black entertainers in the 60s and 70s, especially the athletes. Athletes who use franchising to try to secure their financial futures after they can't play sports anymore. And there's a whole, I think that continues today, where franchising becomes part of the portfolio of Black celebrities and Black entertainers because they feel like this is a sure thing, even though sometimes franchising can be an incredibly economically unstable vehicle for wealth building.
Yes, no, evidently so. This is a question for me, really, that's not in the coming from the audience, but did you initially think that this book could be written without a focus on franchising, or was that really always on the table? Because when I was reading your book, you talk about the first issue of Black Enterprise and
Mhm.
how franchising is on the cover of the magazine. And so I was just wondering if that was something that you ever considered, that maybe that was not going to be such a big deal in your book.
So the first draft of the idea of the book was so boring. It was supposed to be a book about kind of food and civil rights, very broadly. And I was going to write about how, if you look at the memoirs of major civil rights figures, people like Melba Patillo Beals, who integrates Little Rock Central High School in 1957. If you look at, James Baldwin has a story about, I think, being in a coffee shop and this white waitress humiliates him. Like, there are all of these scenes in which restaurants are either a site of trauma, or integrated restaurants are considered this kind of like beloved community possibility. A few years ago, John Lewis gave a speech at Georgetown, and he talks about eating at a Chinese restaurant before the March on Washington. And I thought 50 plus years after this historic moment, he remembers that, because he said, this is not an experience I ever had in Alabama. And so I wanted to kind of like riff on that idea, but I had nothing really to say. I think one of the hardest things as a historian is having a point to what you're writing about, because I could write entire books of things that I just think are interesting and they're not pointing to anything. So all of this is to say that originally the book was supposed to be about the ways that the restaurant figures so prominently in civil rights narratives. And then there's going to be one chapter about McDonald's and Black America. And it was supposed to be about the advertising, the ways that they were trying to make appeals to Black consumers. And then I got more into it and I was like, okay, maybe I'll write a little bit about franchising. And I got feedback from an editor who said, like, the book is here. This is the most interesting and compelling thing that I've read in this proposal. Why don't you go back and see if you can write a whole book about it? And she was absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
What she saw was a story that couldn't be contained.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, the framework of franchising was my best vehicle to talk about the ways that race will always constrict what we believe economic opportunity can provide. Like, no matter how many millions of dollars a Black franchisee makes, he knows that, or she knows that there's a white franchisee who's making more money just by virtue of who they are and the opportunities they get. And I think that way I was able to use franchising as the kind of, the conceit to try to tell the story.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a question from J. Leon Peace. What part does affordability play in the appeal of McDonald's to low-income Black communities?
I really appreciate that question, because one of the things that I try to talk about when I talk about this book is the fact that fast food is a practical, smart choice for a lot of people. That, I wrote this book in response to kind of discourses that I think were particularly offensive and particularly reductive. When, why are those people eating this type of food? And we lose sight of the fact that the food is very practical. It's cheap, it's available fast. You can eat it in between your 2 or 3 jobs. It provides you the kind of fats, carbs, and sugars that you need to haul through the next few hours. And so there's a lot of good reasons to eat fast food. When we live under a system in which people have to work multiple jobs to survive, when people don't have time to be in stable housing with enough electricity and gas to make food every day, it makes perfect sense. The low cost is a large part of it. And I think with the emergence of fast casual as a category in the food space, what we're seeing is that I think McDonald's and Burger King and Taco Bell would be the choice of people who are less affluent, and then that middle space of fast casual, which, I don't know if we mark that as healthy food, but it gives the appearance of a kind of healthiness because, it's in a sterile environment. Like a Chipotle looks like a hospital. And it signals certain ideas about class and food, but it's fast food. Starbucks is fast food. Panera is fast food. But the ways we mark them are so different. And so, when McDonald's was first trying to attract Black consumers, they really did focus on the price point because that made sense. the majority of the people who were purchasing were working class people who were developing a relationship to the marketplace that they had been shut out before. So you want to make it affordable, and it makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have another question from that was sent from an audience member that I think really connects to that opening scene in your book about Ferguson and the role of McDonald's in this chaotic moment in which protesters are using it for relief, but also journalists are plugging their laptops and their cell phones in there. And really the moment we're still in about racial justice and police violence, which is, and this audience member wants to know, what would be your take on McDonald's and other multinational corporations' response to Black Lives Matter? And, here I'm thinking, of course, of just all the companies, right, that
Oh my
have
God, it's
really
so awkward. It's so awkward.
right. I
I
mean,
think I'm not going to do this, but I'm not going to say it. There are only 2 tweets of the summer of 2020 that I appreciated that were like, about the moment. Everything else was just so uncomfortable, including McDonald's that did like a little Twitter video. And at the end it says, like, we see you in our customers, we see you in our employees, we see you in our franchisees. And then they said Black Lives Matter. And I thought, oh God, please don't do this. But it's on brand. McDonald's has consistently tried to enter the conversation at all of these critical moments, whether it's in '68 saying that, King's death inspired them to reach out to the Black community, whether it's in '92 when they said, during the LA rebellion, none of our stores were harmed in South Los Angeles because we've always been there. That Ferguson McDonald's is fascinating to me because it is the backdrop for so much of the drama, and it is also franchised by a Black franchisee. And recently I heard it was also the target of a Fight for 15 campaign. So it's all of the things, right? It's the question about wages and labor, it's this relationship to Black America, and it's also kind of in this moment. And, when McDonald's tweets Black Lives Matter, it's so painful because I think that as one of the largest employers in the country and an employer of so many Black and brown people, there's so many ways that they can show their solidarity. They haven't asked my opinion, but I'm available at McDonald's if you ever want to sit down and talk. Paid sick leave across your franchises could be one of the greatest, signs that Black Lives Matter. But here we are. And what was so fascinating in their tweet, they said, we're giving money to the NAACP. And it's like, yes, you've been doing that since the late 60s. You have been using Black civil rights organizations as both a shield as well as, a prod to try to, do this type of engagement. So McDonald's is going through a lot, though. They're being sued by Black franchise owners. There's some internal racial discrimination lawsuits. They're trying to compete in an increasingly crowded market where fast food is better than it's ever been and more interesting and more creative. And, they're trying.
Well, that generates a follow-up for me about whether McDonald's has weighed in on your book in any form or fashion. Have they made a comment, or has any representative of McDonald's just said anything at all about franchise?
So there's been some awkward moments. So the incoming CEO at the time of McDonald's, Chris Kaminsky, he tweeted his bookshelf from his office, and my book was on there, but I don't know if he had read it yet. Okay. And so I think that there's a misreading that my book is a celebration of Black franchisees. And I think my book is a recognition of what Black franchisees experienced and the complicated role they play. But I wouldn't put this in the category of the, biographies of Ray Kroc or the McDonald's, books that talk about, McDonald's without any critiques. When I was on my book tour in person, I met a few people on the road who had worked for McDonald's. And sometimes they were like, I work there. And I'm like, okay, good luck. And then some people who used to work there who are like, it's worse than you think. And I was like, okay. Recently someone who works with McDonald's as a consultant reached out to me to try to talk to a group. And I said, I just want to be really clear what my position is. I'm happy to share my research with whoever asks, But I make it really clear my critiques of the fast food industry, and McDonald's is included. And I just want you to be sure, like, I'm the one that you want engaging. I think, because I want to be fair and humane in kind of how I engage. And he said, yeah, maybe I don't want to invite you. The one thing that did happen, that what I did find upsetting, was I did a podcast with Business Insider called Brought to You By, where we talked about one of the chapters in the book. And they asked McDonald's for comment, and they said it was an inaccurate portrayal of their commitment to diversity. And I thought that wasn't cool, because to say that my work's inaccurate is not, that's not okay, because of
Right.
the living, right? And so, I can concede that their fries are good. I just don't like the conditions in which they're made.
Yeah.
So that's been my experience with McDonald's.
Yeah. McDonald's, check the receipts. Come on, get into the footnotes. Yeah. There's a lot of really cool questions in here. One that just resonates with me so much as a person that did grow up going to McDonald's with my family, and that's a question about the $1 menu. So what do you see? This is a question. What do you see as the positive and negative impacts of McDonald's $1 menu on BIPOC and low-income communities?
I mean, here's an opportunity to let your family go somewhere. I think so much of what makes the US such a challenging place. I was talking with my mom's an immigrant from Haiti, and she said, the thing about America is that's hard is that when I was in Haiti growing up, I knew I was poor, but everyone else was poor around me. So I didn't have an idea of what it meant to not be poor. But as I got older and I came to the United States, when you're poor in the United States, you have a very clear vision of all the things you're not getting because you're poor. And I think that part of what this book is about is this idea of the consumer experience being wrapped into the idea of being a citizen, of being a person who matters, being a person of value, even if that's really problematic. And I think one of my goals as someone who's very critical of these systems is to never believe that I'm smarter than it or that it can't entrap me. Capitalism works because it makes you always feel less than, and that there is a lack, and you're driven closer and closer to it as a result. That there's a lot of it's seductive, right? And so even though we might say like McDonald's isn't the most special thing in the world, for a family that is cut off from this idea of family consumer citizenship, of going out and going on vacations, buying toys for your kids, McDonald's makes that so accessible with a Happy Meal and a $1 menu. That dollar menu is like key to allowing access to food. If you think about people who are unhoused, if you think about people who are scraping by on a few dollars, like this can provide you a meal and entry to a place to sit down and use the bathroom, access the internet. So the dollar menu is key. The thing that's interesting about innovations like the dollar menu is the disparate impact it then has within the franchise system, because one of the arguments that Black franchisees make is that they're disadvantaged within the system. So when you have deep discounts on food, or when you have initiatives like modernizing the store for the touchscreen, refills, all-day breakfast, all of those things cut into the bottom line. And African-American franchisees, some argue that those types of measures cut into their bottom line greater because of the conditions in which they have to do business, which I think is always really a fascinating other way of looking at the high promotion culture of fast food. And that's something that I came to because I was, working on this book.
That's really fascinating, because it almost shows the contradictions within Ray Kroc's and his kind of like that acronym you had of like quality service, or his acronym, right? There's what you're saying is there's already this kind of built-in inequality within the franchises, within where, depending on where they're placed, right? I mean, you have the story of the one Black franchisee who does finally buy a McDonald's restaurant, but only to find out that it's behind the times. It doesn't have any of the modern equipment that perhaps a suburban McDonald's has. And so how can it meet, those high quality standards and uniformity that was demanded by Kroc himself, right? So I think that that's really fascinating. On the topic of accessibility, um, there's something I think your book does that is really profound for budding scholars and journalists out there that want to write books and exposés about powerful corporations, right? I mean, this is, to quote another historian, the new Gilded Age, right? This is the era of Facebook and Google and so many powerful multinational corporations that journalists and scholars want to write about. They want to demystify their power or expose them. And you wrote a book essentially about a powerful multinational corporation without having access to those corporate archives. Can you say just a little bit more in the kind of mode of perhaps inspiration to other people out there that want to write about these powerful corporations, and maybe show us a little bit underneath the hood as to how you did this, how you accomplished this?
Yeah, so I think, I think I don't know. You can't do the work that we do, Mike, without being kind of relentless and not letting things go. And when I sit down and I write, like I also listen to way too much true crime podcasts like you do, Mike, and I watch a lot of the true crime TV shows. So every time I'm kind of thinking about a topic, I'm thinking of that, like that scene in the show where they have the bulletin board with like all the suspects and all the details of the crime, and you're moving things around. And so when I sit down and I think, okay, here's what is my experience of McDonald's as a Black person? What are the things that I think about? I think about the sponsorships, I think about the commercials, I think about the high profile people who are like, kind of associated with me. I sit down and I write everyone's name down. And then for everyone's name, I go backwards. Where did they go to college? Where did they work? Who were they connected to? And I make these kind of like, these like maps of connection. And then I go to all of those sources. And that's what I had to do with my first book. So I'm at the Library of Congress and I'm like, okay, there's a lawsuit that involves McDonald's and an African-American who's trying to get a franchise. And the NAACP allegedly was sent a letter about it. So I'm going to the NAACP and I'm trying to find the McDonald's stuff there. Now, doing a broad search, I might just, enter McDonald's in the search term and see what I get. But I'm thinking, how are corporations considered people in a lot of legal proceedings and the way that they engage? And if they are people, who are the people around them? And so then, I start searching. Then I think, okay, if the NAACP is getting in the middle of this, then maybe Jesse Jackson's Operation Push got into this, maybe other chapters of the NAACP, maybe the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And then I'm just thinking about kind of relationships and connections. And this is, how we teach what we teach, right? Who is in the room at the same time? And then you get these like wild stories of like, wait, they were talking about this, one of the early consultants to McDonald's is C.T. Vivian, who's like the architect of the civil rights struggle. And I'm trying to imagine him in the offices of McDonald's, like talking to these people, but he's there. So if he's there and his organization is here and his alma mater is here and his associates are here, then I go to all of those places. I had to go to the University of Virginia to get Julian Bond's papers that talk about franchising. Mm-hmm. I didn't imagine that would be one of the stops in a million years. And the thing I'll say about that, for those who are part of, the academic community, this is why these projects take a long time, and that's why they cost a lot of money. Mm-hmm. I mean, funding is so important because I had to fly in person and I had to go through every single box and every single folder to see like where I can find the tidbits.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we have another question here again from J. Leon Peace. And he says, clearly not foreseen, how has McDonald's adapted to deal with its essential role in providing shelter to the homeless populations throughout the US, particularly the 24-hour stores? Really good question.
The fast food restaurants have all responded in different ways. Some have seen this as a reason for a lot of security. And so this is why sometimes at some locations you might see, the kind of like private security people, at the stores. Throughout the 70s, 80s, and there's some of it today, there's concern about McDonald's contributing to juvenile delinquency and truant behavior. So there might be like a school resource officer close to the McDonald's, close to the school. But in terms of, the business responses to people being there, sometimes there's McDonald's, and it's sometimes an indicator of what the larger community is struggling with, that might have rules about how long you can sit there, right? You start to see the implementation of rules that, one wonders if they're violating the Civil Rights Act of '64, rules about who can use the bathroom, security locks on bathrooms, codes, tokens, right? All of the resources that people who don't have homes may use a fast food restaurant for. There starts to be kind of these measures and protocols of surveillance and security to kind of discourage it. Sometimes this happens with senior citizens who like to use McDonald's as their spot. And depending on, how the community views that, they might welcome it with free coffee for seniors, or they might tell seniors, you can sit here for an hour and then you have to leave. And so, this just shows us the great need for public space. And this is why I'm so glad this talk is sponsored by the library. Everything good that I've ever done started at a public library, but it's one of the few places that you can be, right? Absolutely. Without purchasing anything, without, showing identification. You can just be in a library and learn and engage in community. And increasingly, there's so few places where that can happen.
Yes, no, thank you so much, public libraries, for existing. And I'm gonna in a question or two pivot to Melissa, but there's another kind of sub theme, really a really big theme in your book that perhaps you don't use this word as frequently, but neoliberalism and really this notion that that the private sphere, that industry, that businesses can play a role in what the state is supposed to do, right? And as this question shows, there is a need for public spaces. McDonald's has become this kind of ad hoc space for gathering and congregating for the people that are unsheltered or that are in other ways marginalized in our societies, right? People that are elderly. What is something that maybe you did not know about neoliberalism that maybe you learned from writing your book and finishing your book, just about the state of things now, that you can share with us?
For a few years before I finished this book, I thought of the shorthand topic sentence of this book is how McDonald's replaced the state in Black America. And I was like, wow, that's such an aggressive claim. Who am I to make it? And I kind of wish I had made it. Stuck with it because it's kind of true. I think the thing that surprised me when we talk about neoliberalism, essentially what we're talking about is gutting the public sector and leaving the private sector a lot of leeway and a lot of permission to engage in what we would consider public goods. And I think what struck me about doing this research and thinking about this fundamental problem is that I started to see the ways that when the problem is around racial justice, how that becomes like twofold the solution. So we've seen the critique that privatization has kind of ruined everyone's good time, or everyone's possibilities rather. But I don't think I realized just how much privatization as a response to racial injustice was the move. That this isn't just about every community. This is about certain communities that are most vulnerable to these ideas. And if we think about it at its most basic level of this past summer, of the recent past, George Floyd didn't die because there's not enough Black-owned businesses in Minneapolis. Like that's not how it works. But shortly after his death, you would think that was the issue, right? If you were a Martian from outer space and you saw the number of companies that are saying, we'll support Black businesses and, order a sandwich from a Black business, you would have thought these two things were related, but they're not. But under this kind of system, this playbook of the federal government and the playbook of civil society, that's always the answer. That's
Right.
the reason why people, are distraught and filled with grief and victimized. It's just they don't have an opportunity to spend money in local stores. And you're like, what are you talking about? And so I think those connections were even clearer because I knew that King's death facilitated this pivot towards Black communities, but I don't think I realized just what was being sold to Black communities as business in exchange for actually thoughtful consideration of the rights of people.
So in the few minutes we have left, Marcia, is there anything that you want to share with our audience or ask or just contribute that maybe we're not asking you?
Well, I love to talk about what I'm reading, and I think you should all read this book that's coming out soon called "Making Mexican Chicago: From Post-War Settlement to the Age of Gentrification" by Mike Amezcua. I think your book is the perfect complement to my book. I really do, because you are talking about Chicago and the Mexican and Mexican American community having to make some of these same tough decisions about what the future is going to look like, what to accept, what not to accept, the role of business, how you fight back and how you concede. And so Making Mexican Chicago, bookmark it. You might want to you can pre-order it now too. On the University of Chicago site, it'll be out in the winter of 2022. And I'm so excited that this gets to be my job, that I get to tell stories that are a little weird and that people have joined me and trusted me to tell kind of weird stories. This is such an exciting time, I think, for history, because there's an understanding that we can shift the lens and we can still reach a lot of people, that this isn't niche, this is actually American history, and this is a story, or these are ways of telling stories that we're like desperately in need of.
Absolutely. That's well put, Marcia, and thank you for plugging my book, which yes, has so many overlaps with your terrific work. So another question for you is really about what's next for Marcia Chatelain. What are you working on now?
I need to take a nap, but I think that the reality is that the past year of being able to talk about this book and the recognition has just inspired me to keep on going. I want to continue to think about this period of time between 1968 and 1980 that is often forgotten about because it doesn't have the gravitas of the 1950s struggle, and it doesn't have the same pressing demands of the war on drugs and the rise of the Reagan years, but is so filled with this kind of sense that anything's possible. The reason why the 70s are such an important time to study, because no one has an idea of the direction of the country. There's war, there is, this deep desire for racial justice and economic change. There's all of this experimentation, everyone is trying everything out. And so I would like to continue thinking about those years after 1968 and thinking about, what people were imagining was possible for the future. So I'm super excited to be able to do that. And I'm so excited for there to just be a community of scholars to run ideas by and to share insights. And, I include you as one of the very best in doing that, because, we have finally been given, we don't have a full seat at the table quite yet because power is like that, but we have a folding chair, and we're making the most of that folding chair by showing people what's possible when you tell different stories.
Absolutely, Marcia. Yeah, I feel that period you've just kind of carved out there is so important. It's so critical. There's kind of the seedlings of that in franchise, where you point to these veteran civil rights activists who are now advisors to corporations, perhaps faculty members or staff members in Afro-American studies departments that are, as you point out, are going to be really important in the 1980s in shaping a new generation of Black thinkers and really pushing the boundaries um, of rights and rights making in the United States and in the globe, right? So I'm looking forward to, and I'm sure everyone else here is looking forward to what else you're going to bring to our deeper scholarly conversation. I think that let's see if there's maybe one more question that I can look at here. I think we've covered so much ground, and it's just been fantastic to talk to you about this. I know that we talk informally about this stuff when we hang out, but I've definitely learned so much from your book as an urban and Latinx historian. It has taught me so much about how McDonald's and fast food really played a role in seizing on this investment of urban America, and really shapes it materially in ways that resonate not only with for me as a scholar, but resonate with me as a person that grew up in Los Angeles in a particular place and time where McDonald's was surrounded our community, right? So I really appreciated that. I'm now going to hand it over to Melissa to close out our event. So thank you so much, Marcia.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you so much, Marcia, for such an incredible conversation. We learned so much. It was so robust, and I think we got to cover most of the questions. Thank you for all who participated today, before. I just want to to flag a few events that we have coming up in the next few weeks, starting with one that we have next week called Decolonize the Dance Floor, which is with a dancer and activist. So here is the link down there. Please stay in touch. Thank you for the DC Public Library, or to the DC Public Library, for co-sponsoring this event with us. And I hope you all have a beautiful afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.